In this lecture, we are putting together a foundation to download our HTTP data from the internet. We are going to go to Qt Creator and do that. Here we are in Qt Creator. We're going to create our new project. It's a Qt Quick application. We're going to call it REST Client V1 Demo. Hit Next. Choose your version of Qt. We choose the kit we want to use here, and we finish. The first thing we want to do is to create a helper C++ class. We're going to do that. Add a new C++ class. It's going to be called app wrapper. It's going to inherit QObject, and we finish. Let's go to the header. Because we are downloading data from the internet, we're going to need a few networking classes. We're going to need QNetwork Access Manager, QNetwork Reply, and QNetwork Request. If you are rusty on this, you should take a basic course on Qt, and I happen to have one where we talk about these things, so you should check that out if you are having problems understanding this. We want to create a private section for the class here. We are going to create objects for these classes. We're going to say QNetwork Access Manager. We're going to need a QNetwork Reply object in here. We're going to need a QByte array. And we're going to need a QString list to keep list of our jokes. So we're going to say mjokes here. We want to provide a public method that is going to be callable from QML that is going to download HTTP data. We're going to have it return nothing. It's going to be called fetch posts. And it's going to take an integer for the number of posts. We want this to be callable from QML, so we're going to decorate it with the QInvocable macro. We also want to do another one. It's going to be void. It's going to remove last item. We want to provide a getter for the jokes here, so we go to refactor, provide a getter member function, and we're going to have it here. This jokes method is going to have an implementation in the CPP file. We also want to implement our custom methods here. Let's do that. Refactor, implement in CPP, refactor, implement in CPP. And here we are. We are also going to need a few slots to deal with networking. You're going to see how we're going to use these in a moment. I want to make this private, so I'm going to say private slots and put my slots in here. The first one is going to be called every time we have something new to read from our network request. And the second one is going to be used when everything has finished downloading. We want to implement these slots. We're going to use them in a moment. Let's do that. And we want to come to the constructor here and initialize a few things. We want to initialize our net manager and net reply here, so we should do that in the initializer list. We want to do it like this. Net reply. The net reply is going to be null pointer. When we start here, we're going to put in some data later. And for data buffer, we want to say new QByte array. This will do. Now we want to see how to fetch our posts. We're going to put in a constant string for the API endpoint. You remember it from the slides. It is this link here. But we need to put a dynamic string that specifies the number of posts that we want. And it's really easy to do. We're going to say plus here. We say QString number, and we pass in the number we got from the parameter. Let's do number here, and this should be fine. We are going to create a QNetwork request object in here, so we should include it to the top here. Let's come back down here and say QNetwork request. We want to set the URL to the endpoint here. we're going to say request set URL and say API endpoint here. And we are going to send the request. How do we do that? We're going to say mnet reply equals mnet manager get, and we pass in the request that we just built to the top here. And this is how you send the request to fetch HTTP data from the internet. Now we want to connect the signals from this net reply to the slots that we defined in here. We're going to say connect. We want to connect this to the ready read slot that we have in here. So we're going to say this. And we want to connect mnet reply, qnetwork reply finished to our data read finished slot here. So we're going to say this, and this will do. And every time we have something new to read, we're going to land in here, and we're going to do something in a minute. Every time we finish reading the data for good, we're going to fall in here. And this is where we are going to parse the JSON that we get. We want to come in data read here. Data ready read is going to be very easy. We are actually going to append whatever we read from the network reply to the buffer. We're going to say mdata buffer, append mnet reply read all. Okay, everything we read from the net reply is going to be stored in the buffer here. And we're going to append that. Every time we come in here, we're going to add something new to what we had before. I hope this makes sense. When we finish reading everything, the first thing we want to do is to check if there wasn't some kind of error. And the way you do that, you say if mnet reply error. You say that there was some kind of error. And if everything is okay, we do something else. If there's an error, we want to qdebug something. So we're going to include qdebug and come back down here, qdebug. And we get the error that we got by saying mnet reply error string. We put it out for the user to see. If we don't have an error, we're going to fall in here and we're going to keep doing our work. The first thing we want to do is to turn the data we have in the buffer into a JSON document that we can parse. We want to grab the value array, Control A, Control I to align. If we go back to the API link, we're going to see that we have a value array in the response that we get for our request here. This is what we are capturing in our code. And we do that by saying QJSON array. We say data, and we read the value field, and we turn that into an array. And you see, we don't have autocomplete. We must have forgotten to include these classes. This is a good time to do it. So we include QJSON document, QJSON array, and QJSON object. And if I come back here and delete this and do to array, you see that it is recognized now. Right now, what we have is an array of JSON objects. If we go back to our link, it is the list here of values that we have. This 0, 1, 2, 3. And what we are interested in is reading this joke here. That's what we're going to do in a moment. We're going to loop through this list and capture the joke data for every item in the list. Let's go back to Qt Creator and do that. So we're going to loop over this array. We're going to say for every iteration, we're going to create a JSON object for the item at the index I and turn that into an object. And we are going to capture the joke string. We're going to say QString. We're going to say object joke and turn that into a string by saying toString here. And by now we should have our joke data inside this string. We should output it for us to see. We're going to say qdebug and say joke. This is going to be enough. And by now we are able to get data from the internet. The remaining thing for us to test this is to find a way to trigger the call for this method here. The first thing we need to do is to expose this class as a context property. So we should go back to main. You already know how to do this. We're going to include the QML context. We're going to include app wrapper. We are going to create an instance of it. Let's call it wrapper. And we are going to expose this to QML. We're going to say engine root context. We call it wrapper, and we pass in the address of our wrapper object right here. We should go to QML, put in a button. We don't need anything fancy. We're going to say import Qt quick controls and put a button down here. And we should give a title here, by the way. Let's say REST client v1. This will do. The button is going to have an ID. The text is going to say fetch. And when it is clicked, we want to do something. We want to say wrapper fetch posts, and we want to fetch 5 posts. Why not? We forgot a colon in here. Let's build to see that we have no boo-boos. Compile output. The build is fine. Let's run. And if everything is okay, we should see our jokes in the application output in here when we hit this button here. Let's do that. And you see that we are saying a few things in here. Okay, this should be our data that we are getting from the internet. These are the jokes from the API that we used. We can go back in here and put in the number of items that we got from the internet. We can do that here. Let's say qdebug number of items. And we should say array size. This will do. Let's run again. This is going to prove to us that we are getting what we asked for. Remember, we are getting 5 jokes, and the number of jokes is 5. This is fine. And this is what we set out to do in this lecture. We are able to download the data from the internet using the API endpoint that we used here. The bulk of this application is really to be able to use QNetwork Access Manager. You have to be able to create a request like this. You send the request and you keep an object to manage your request in NetReply here. And we do everything in the slots that we connect to the signals of the NetReply object here. One is data ready read, in which we append the data we get in our buffer. And the other one is the slot that says that we have finished our download and we can capture the data that we have in the buffer. And we do exactly that right here by creating a JSON document out of it. And we parse the data to get joke data right here. In the next lecture, we're going to figure out a way to feed this joke data to our QML file that we have in here and be able to scroll through joke data. I'll see you in the next lecture.